Our business demands that we work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, supplying major contracts throughout the northwest of England. Downtime to us is an important factor in getting goods to our customers at the required times. We use all sorts of engineering products from Arrow Engineering, bearings, belts, couplings, Dodge bearings in various sizes, the new ISN bearings, easy to fit, easy to assemble, quick to release after they've been on a few years in arduous conditions. Any engineering jobs that we may have, Arrow Engineering sorts them out for us. Placement parts that they manufacture for us in their engineering department. They can turn us gears, make shafts, do alterations at very short notice. Arrow Engineering are totally reliable 24 hours a day. Service with a phone call, they never let us down.
This program is intended to provide the basic knowledge for the proper installation and maintenance of the Dodge Imperial line of bearings, the Imperial IP, ISAF, and the metric ISN. Always refer to the appropriate instruction manuals for specific procedures. The Dodge Imperial line of bearings are adapter mount spherical roller bearings, which incorporate a unique mounting and dismounting method. Rotation of the lock nut clockwise mounts the bearing, and rotation of the lock nut counterclockwise dismounts the bearing. This revolutionary method is exclusive to the Dodge Imperial line of bearings and has been patented by Rockwell Automation. Different housing configurations are available, including 2-bolt pillow blocks, 4-bolt pillow blocks, 4-bolt flange bearings, piloted flange bearings, wide slot take-up bearings, and the latest version split cap ISAF pillow block. All these housing variations are available in expansion and non-expansion designs. Preparing for bearing installation. Prior to bearing installation, inspect the shaft to ensure that it is smooth, straight, and clean. If a nick is found, remove the raised area with a file. Next, use an emery cloth, sandpaper, or Scotch-Brite to clean all fretting, corrosion, and fine nicks from the shaft. Now, ensure the shaft is within commercial shaft tolerances. Due to our adapter mount design, standard commercial shafting tolerances can be used. This chart reflects the recommended tolerances. We will be mounting a 2 7/16 inch Imperial IP bearing, which requires a shaft diameter of 2.4375 inches with a tolerance of nothing minus 0.003 of an inch. Next, apply a coating of light oil or other rust inhibitor to the exposed shaft surface to prevent corrosion. The tools required to mount the Imperial line of bearings include an Allen wrench, drift and hammer, marker, a mic, and a torque wrench to tighten the base bolts once the bearing is mounted. Rockwell Automation also offers an Imperial impact spanner wrench to simplify the installation process. Remove the bearing from the box and packaging. An instruction manual is supplied with each bearing and should be read prior to mounting. We will be mounting a 2 7/16 inch Imperial IP pillow block bearing. A typical application requires a 2-bearing system in order for the application to operate properly. It's recommended that a fixed bearing and a float or expansion bearing be used. The fixed bearing should always be mounted first and is typically mounted on the drive side of the application. The float bearing is mounted last for positioning purposes. The bearing is equipped with a lock plate, which is secured to the face of the lock nut. Remove the button head cap screws using an Allen wrench. Remove the lock plate and set it aside. We will reinstall the lock plate after the bearing is mounted. All adapter mount bearings require weight to be removed during mounting to ease bearing drive-up and to minimize the mounting force. This can be done via a sling, jacks, or, as in our case, using supports. Rotate the lock nut counterclockwise 1 to 2 turns while holding the adapter sleeve. This will allow the adapter to fully expand. Slide the bearing to the desired position on the shaft. If the bearing does not slide onto the shaft easily, loosen the lock nut another 1 to 2 turns and repeat the process. Now the bearing lock nut needs to be tightened to its zero reference point or starting position. The zero reference point is defined as the point when the clearance between the adapter sleeve, shaft, and bearing bore is removed, and all mating surfaces are in metal-to-metal contact. This is achieved by tightening the lock nut clockwise, using both hands until the lock nut can no longer be rotated by hand. Once the zero reference point is achieved, scribe a line on the face of the lock nut and adapter sleeve. It is good practice to scribe the lock nut face in line with the slot on the adapter sleeve. Next, determine the appropriate amount of lock nut rotation required for mounting. This information is shown in the instruction manual supplied with the bearings. In the case of the 2 7/16 inch Imperial IP bearing, the rotation of the lock nut from zero position is 1 full turn. Rotate the lock nut 1 full rotation from the scribed zero reference point. Once the full turn is achieved, the bearing is mounted. To confirm that bearings up to 2 15/16 have been mounted properly, you can check the number of threads exposed on the adapter. There should only be between 0 to 1 thread showing. On larger bearings, 0 to 2 threads is normal. Next, slide the lock plate into position by aligning the tang of the lock plate with the slot of the adapter sleeve. Find a lock nut hole that aligns with the lock plate hole or slot. If the closest lock nut hole is beyond a lock plate hole, scribe the adapter at the next closest lock plate hole. You need to tighten the lock nut to meet with the lock plate hole or slot. Next, insert the lock washer and button head cap screws into the lock plate. The fixed bearing has now been properly mounted to shaft. We will now mount the float bearing. The Imperial IP, ISAF, and metric ISN float bearings are mounted the same way as fixed bearings. The only difference is the positioning of the housing with respect to the bearing to accommodate shaft growth due to thermal expansion. Follow the same mounting procedures as the fixed bearing as shown in the previous segment. Once the bearing is properly mounted, it now can be attached to the mounting structure. When the bearing and shaft assembly is placed into position, insert the base bolts into the fixed bearing and tighten them by hand. Then insert the base bolts into the float bearing, making sure that the float housing has been shifted in the correct direction so it will accommodate shaft thermal growth. Next, make sure that the bearing housings are aligned by the use of a straight edge or laser. At this point, we are now able to torque the mounting bolts to their required torque values. The bearing assembly has now been properly mounted. Relubrication of Imperial IP, ISAF, and metric ISN bearings. Grease fittings are supplied with each bearing for relubrication purposes. The bearings are pre-lubricated at the factory with lithium-based grease and should be relubricated with a compatible grease. The standard grease fill out of the box is 30 to 40% full. Due to various operating conditions such as speed, temperature, and contamination levels, relubrication intervals vary, and the instruction manual should be used as a reference guide. Bearings should be relubricated while in operation if possible. This can be done with the use of a standard handheld grease gun. Greasing during operation is done to guarantee equal grease distribution throughout the bearing and to minimize temperature rise, which occurs with relubrication. A good rule of thumb is to continue to add grease until fresh grease is seen purging past the bearing seal. In the Imperial line of bearings, seals are designed to purge excess grease from the bearing as the internal bearing pressure increases. There will be a temperature rise, which you can see with the aid of a thermocouple inserted in the bearing housing. As the excess grease and the remaining grease is channeled and distributed throughout the bearing, the temperature will decrease and stabilize. We have accomplished two very important requirements to achieving long bearing life. First, we have introduced fresh grease to the internal surfaces of the bearing, which help prevent bearing wear, and second, we have purged contaminated and deteriorated grease from the bearing. Dismounting Imperial IP, ISAF, and metric ISN bearings. To dismount the bearing, first loosen the base bolts. Now remove the weight. Next, remove the button head cap screws and lock plate. Now begin to rotate the lock nut counterclockwise using a drift and hammer or the Imperial impact spanner wrench. Continue to drive the lock nut counterclockwise until bearing is released from shaft. The bearing has now been properly dismounted.